Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and it's the horrors of war when I put Sam Peckinpah's Cross of Iron against Jean-Jacques Annaud's Enemy at the Gates. And this one was a real tough decision to make because there's a lot of like nitpicky things we can go through with this one. But the main thing is how do you depict war on the screen? Now, Sam Fuller stated that it is impossible to capture war on the screen because war is so graphic that it is impossible to even show to an audience. And there are moments where both of these filmmakers come close to depicting war on the screen, but it's all going to come down to who did it the best and who basically conveyed the true horrors of war. So first up, we have Sam Peckinpah's Cross of Iron, which stars James Coburn, Maximilian Schell, and James Mason. And the film centers around a group of German soldiers on the Russian front in the year 1943. And of course, the Germans on the Russian front were getting their asses kicked left and right. And Peckinpah had never made a war movie up until this one. This was his first and really only war movie. I mean, technically, he touches on like the Mexican Revolution in The Wild Bunch, and he kind of touches on the Civil War in Major Dundee, but never on a direct scale the way he deals with World War II and the Germans on the Russian front. And James Coburn plays Steiner, who he's been on the front lines for a while, and him and his men, they're very weathered, kind of disillusioned by the cause, so to speak, so that they could care less about what aristocracy or bureaucracy or any of that shit, which is represented by Stronsky, played by Maximilian Schell, who comes in. He just wants his Cross of Iron. He doesn't give a fuck about anything else. And we also see like the way Peckinpah depicts war in this film is almost on a scale that Sam Fuller was talking about. There are moments in this film that are like genuinely like haunting. There's a scene where a Jeep drives over a decaying body that you can tell has been drove over several times. And of course, Peckinpah was also really good at shooting and directing and editing action sequences. And of course, the action is very well cross cut with all the other stuff in the film, and it really just shows the brutality of war. And there's nothing glorified about it. There's nothing sexy about it. Even when in the middle of the film, James Coburn's character Steiner ends up in the hospital, and he kind of carries on a brief liaison with one of the nurses, similar to what Charlton Heston does in Major Dundee. This was a common theme in Peckinpah's work, where you take a break from the violence, you get a little pussy, but even that is not done in a sexual, and it's not done in a sexy way, because this motherfucker is clearly going through like PTSD, and he just needed something to kind of cling on to and stuff. But the biggest clash is between Steiner and Stronsky, and the very brilliantly done by Maximilian Schell and James Coburn, because Maximilian Schell represents, he's Prussian royalty and stuff, so he's gonna come out all right. And whereas Steiner, he may survive the war, but there's not much going to be left of him, like physically or psychologically. And we see that at the end of the film, though, where it's kind of the last stand. This was another big theme of Peckinpah's work, where it was, the guys that hated each other, they still came together because men could work with each other. And it is what it is. But we see Steiner, who starts out into the battlefield all raring to go and stuff, and then once he gets there, he kind of becomes a calamity, and we hear Coburn laughing over the soundtrack, and it just kind of a thumb note to how absurd war is and stuff. So sometimes it may be necessary, but what, you really lose at the end of the day. And then we look at Jean-Jacques Annaud's Enemy at the Gates, which features Jude Law as one of the as the famous Vasily, who was the big hero of Stalingrad and stuff, a sniper who, and the thing about Enemy at the Gates, it does kind of have a lot of great battle sequences, and it does show you a lot of the horrors of war. But at the end of the day, this film kind of feels like a Hollywood a Hollywood epic. It doesn't really it in a way it's kind of a it tries to be a lot more sexy because you got actors like Jude Law and Joseph Fiennes and Rachel Weisz, and you've also got it dealing with more of like you're dealing with a war hero essentially, and so whenever you're making a movie about a war hero, you tend to show more of the glory of war and instead of what you really lose. And of course, like Rachel Weisz die. A lot of motherfuckers die and shit, and he comes out successful, but it's still like just kind of it doesn't really like get to the grittiness that Cross of Iron does. And honestly, there could have you could have shaved a lot of time off of it too, because there's a lot of like sweeping vistas with some like dramatic music to really insinuate how like dark and gritty it is. Whereas like with Peckinpah, it was almost, you know, kind of a thumb your nose at how shitty war was. Because it's also the thing, though, Sam Peckinpah did actually serve in the military at the end of World War II. Whereas I don't know Jean Jacques Annaud's background, but when you got a good second unit directing team that can do a lot of like very good pyrotechnics and stuff. Because the thing about it is, you can tell they had a lot of money on Enemy at the Gates, and they could afford pretty decent actors and stuff. And now another thing too, there's a thing that bugs me, and it's not necessarily like a major thing because like Enemy at the Gates centers all around the Battle of Stalingrad and stuff like that, and it really does show how like fucked up that situation was and how all the fucking hell that they had to go through just to hold down that city from the fucking Nazi takeover and shit. And you've got Ed Harris as like a Nazi sniper who's going against Vasilia, and the actually Ed Harris is attempting a German accent, whereas like most of the other motherfuckers that are supposed to be playing Russian sound British as hell. Mostly Jude Law, Rachel Weisz, and Joseph Fiennes. Now I will give Bob Hoskins his due. He does as Khrushchev. He does at least attempt a Russian accent and does a pretty decent job of it. Whereas like you look at something like Cross of Iron, it kind of goes 50-50. Like James Mason's clearly just sounded like James Mason. James Coburn is doing a variation of it, whereas you got kind of a mixture of like German and English and American actors all through there. You also have I forget his name, but he was a regular in Rainer Werner Fassbinder's films. He was the lead guy in World on a Wire, and he played the estranged husband in The Marriage of Maria Braun. So you get a mixture, and they're all speaking English, but you kind of hear the hint of German. It's a pretty good mixture and stuff. But where it comes down to the decision on this one is basically like, what's just the better movie? And I honestly think Cross of Iron is the better movie because one, it's not so full of shit. You know, one, it doesn't focus on like romance and shit. There is that brief liaison in the middle, but like most Peckinpah films, you deal with you take a break from the carnage and then you just immediately go back into it and everything. And then also, I honestly think the acting is better in Cross of Iron. Like you really get a sense of like how shitty everything is when it comes to war and the what you really lose, as opposed to like, at the end, you went through all this shit, but there's glory at the end of it. The ending of Cross of Iron is so perfect, just that James Coburn laughing it off. It's like there is no glory. It means nothing, even though you win, think about the amount of shit that you lose type thing. But and also movie about the Germans getting their ass whooped on the Russian front. According to Orson Welles, it was the greatest anti-war film of all time. And honestly, if you're making a war film and it's not an anti-war film, then you're not doing your fucking job. Because you should. I guess the only like technically pro-war films would be propaganda films. But the thing about Enemy at the Gates that I gotta, take away points from, but like I said, it just feels like a Hollywood production, mixed with a bunch of English actors and a good second unit team. Whereas like Peckinpah had probably maybe half the money they had and made a fucking war film that was so in your face and gritty that it would stay under your skin forever. So this round clearly goes to Cross of Iron. And for anybody keeping score, that is 91 to 71. 70s are up by 20 now. Like I said, it's real back and forth, back and forth. The lead continues to grow with the 70s, but who knows? The 90s could probably shrink that lead, just given the chance because, they got a lot of hitters too. And if I've said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. This is just one asshole's opinion on a very long, self indulgent journey to see which decade was better for movies, the 70s or the 90s. And it's looking like I'm right with the 70s, but we still got a long way to go before I can officially say that I'm right. And if this doesn't make sense, well, who knows? It's probably not meant to make sense. All I know is I got to know for me on a personal level, and all I know is this: war is hell, and it's a damn hard thing to depict on the screen. But some people manage it, but they still don't even get to the fraction of the hell that it is.